back issue section of the bulletin.
And also there's an annual meeting. I mean, there's special meetings. I know I've seen
There's
some brilliant agenda of
often our meetings are more scientists and government officials, but there are sometimes public meetings where members come together and other people who aren't members and speakers. And so we've had quite a few opportunities to build a community. So in a sense, MAPS is also a community building mechanism for people interested in psychedelics. But just before I go too far, I'd just like to respond to one thing that you say. I guess the first thing I'd like to say is just that you talked about my academic credentials. So given that this area is so controversial and that people who are interested in psychedelics and marijuana are dismissed as flakes, I felt it was necessary to try to develop as much of my academic credentials as I could. And so I just recently completed a Ph.D. at Harvard at the Kennedy School of Government in public policy. And my dissertation was focused on the regulation of the medical use of Schedule I drugs. So I really learned quite a lot, and because the Kennedy School is sort of inner establishment, I was able to have access to a lot of the people at the FDA and the National Center on Drug Abuse and the DEA, and so I have been educated quite a bit in this process of how to take Schedule I drugs through the drug development process.
Wow.
Yeah, and then my dissertation is actually up on the MAPS website as well. My master's was at the Kennedy School also. And in contrast, my undergraduate degree was at a fantastic school that I would encourage anybody who's of college age to consider, New College of Florida in Sarasota, Florida. It's a small 650 student college. It's the honors college of the state of Florida. And it's an experimental college, no grades, just written evaluations, and a heavy emphasis on independent study and scholarship. And it has a higher percentage of students that go on to get PhDs than Harvard does as an undergraduate institution.
What's the name of the school?
New College.
New College.
New College of Florida in Sarasota, Florida. It's absolutely tremendous. Of course, we all talk about the good old days. When I went there, I started in 1971. That's where I first learned about LSD and mescaline and psilocybin and marijuana and other drugs. And it was experimental, not just in its academics, but in its social context. The all-night dance parties that were held several times a year, where people took psychedelics and danced till sunrise, were a part of that. So the early rave kind of experiences were able to be held at that school. The swimming pool, it's outside in Florida, so it's really warm there, and it was clothing optional, so we had a kind of a nudist colony around the pool for college students. It was just
oh my Lord,
extraordinary, and you could tell why I loved going to school there. But because it's such a, even though it is the honors college of the state of Florida,
you're going to stimulate interest in academics all over the country.
I hope so. But that's where I felt like I needed to really go to someplace credentialed when I really wanted to start working more socially in policy transformation, policy reform. And it's been a great opportunity for me to be there. So I feel like I really have experience both in the value of psychedelics, in the value of marijuana, and in the oppression of the system, but then I've also learned to try to work with the system and understand how our regulatory system and government works. And there is room for change, and I think fundamentally that what MAPS is trying to accomplish, to create social legal contexts for the beneficial use of psychedelics and marijuana, that it's fundamentally not something that will destroy or erode the culture from the inside. It's not counterculture. I see the value of the whole countercultural movement in the 60s and on, but I think really identifying ourselves as counterculture is really self-defeating ultimately, and that idea...
Well, that's never made a lot of sense to me either, I mean, quite frankly.
Yeah, so I think the sense of what we have to offer to the larger society is something beneficial and something that the society would be well advised to incorporate, and suppresses it at its own extreme cost. And so that's the fundamental intuition, which is that what we're trying to accomplish is really good for the police, good for the oppressors, good for the country. And so we don't have to feel guilty or somehow ashamed of what we're trying to do, but just have to recognize that the ignorance and fear that have been built up over these
And paranoia,
decades
yeah.
in paranoia, which have
Yeah,
been,
I mean, what about, I mean, just now that we brought up the idea of fear and paranoia and disinformation, what about ecstasy and the PET scans?
Okay, well, okay, I'll get to that, but here's a good example of disinformation. And the message now I have is that we need to really evaluate everything that we think is true and go to the source. That was one of the great parts about doing a dissertation at Harvard, is that you have to, and everywhere, you have to really document everything that you think that you know. So my dissertation is heavily footnoted, actually boring, because it moves really slowly. You can't make any grand leaps. Every link in the chain has to be documented, and an enormous amount of what we've been told and what we believe to be true about drugs is false. And as an example, I would like to point to a falsehood that you put forward that apparently you believe, that is evidence that you've been the victim of disinformation. You talked about Art Linkletter's daughter who committed suicide.
Right, that's what I've heard
under the
that quoted a
influence
lot.
of LSD.
I'm ignorant about many things, so,
Right.
yeah, what's the truth
The
there?
story is that Art Linkletter did have a daughter, and she did commit suicide, but she was not under the influence of LSD when she committed suicide. She had taken LSD several months before, and this was quite a while afterwards. And it was something that tapped into a lot of her emotional problems. He had another child that also committed suicide. And there's been this sense that drugs in his situation proved to be a convenient scapegoat. It wasn't because there was a difficult childhood. It wasn't anything to do with...
In fact, that's a pattern. Blame it on drugs. Blame it on, well, they're a marijuana smoker, or they're an acid hit, or...
Exactly. Drugs as scapegoats is a good way to try to understand it. And so there was one of the prime examples. I mean, you can imagine the anguish of a parent who has a child commit suicide. That's a horrible situation. And a lot of what happens with your children is totally out of your control. The way I have 3 children myself, they're born, you think that you are influencing them, and to some limited extent you are, but their genetic makeup, their moods, their intelligence, a lot of things are set right from internal as they are born and as they're developing in the womb. You really, it's like a sailboat in the wind. You can adjust yourself a little bit with the boat to deal with the wind, but really, you know, the basic nature is given to you, and you have to learn how to work with it. And so these children are not really something that we can take complete credit for or complete blame for what happens. We have a limited role as parents. And so I think when things go wrong, the first inclination is to blame ourselves, and if not, then to blame something else from the outside. And so for Art Linkletter, LSD was a convenient thing to blame. Not to say that LSD had no role in her suicide. It definitely can bring out issues and problems that people, if they aren't supported in a cultural context, can make problems worse. There are a lot of people who've taken LSD, had difficult and painful experiences, and feel burdened by them for years and decades to come. There are also people who've had LSD experiences that have been profoundly healing and helpful and feel benefited for years and decades to come. It's not in the drug, it's in the relationship that the person and the drug and the context within which they take it. So I think that the emphasis then has to be on taking things to the source. So your other question was, what about ecstasy? What about the holes in the brain and brain damage with neurotoxicity? What's the real story about all of that? My personal view of that is that really ecstasy, MDMA, well, first off, we should say that ecstasy, as we just said, half of the time it's not really ecstasy, it's fake, it's something else. But with pure MDMA, it's clear that it does influence serotonin levels when it's given at high enough doses to animals, and that those serotonin changes persist for a period of years, sometimes maybe permanent. Whether that happens at the doses that people take, and if it does happen, whether it matters, are 2 separate questions. So does it happen at the doses people take? The evidence for that is pretty controversial. In fact, there have been brain scans that the National Institute on Drug Abuse has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars and more to make into postcards and distribute, and they've funded millions of dollars worth of research into it. And what they claim is that MDMA users, compared to match controls, are lower on average in serotonin levels.